Some people think history is just a pile of dates and dry numbers on rotten paper. But for me, history smells like cold iron. It smells like the Atlantic, salt in the air, mixed with the stink of clotted blood. In the last episode, we saw how those cursed raids turned the peace of our green villages into ash. We saw our brothers and sisters dragged out of tall grass with terror in their eyes. But that was only the beginning of the nightmare. Today, I'm taking you somewhere that feels like even God forgot it existed. I'm taking you to the Gold Coast, to Ghana, a place where tall white stone walls rose out of the ocean like the teeth of a starving giant. Castles that looked like grand palaces from far away, but inside there was nothing but darkness and death. This is Elmina Castle, built in 1482. The Portuguese called it São Jorge da Mina. They said they built it for the gold trade, but the real gold being traded in there was human flesh and skin. Picture it. The air on Ghana's coast is always heavy and humid. The sun beats down like a furnace, but the moment you pass through those massive wooden gates, it felt like stepping into an underground world where the sun had died. The smell of damp, the stale sweat of hundreds of shaking bodies, that was the smell of the white castles. In one of those cells, there was a young man named Kofi. Just weeks earlier, Kofi had been in his field planting beans. He had hands that understood soil, hands that knew how to play a little instrument for his small daughter. But now those hands were locked to an iron ring. Kofi sat in the absolute darkness of one of those dungeons. A dungeon with a ceiling so low you couldn't even stand up straight. The floor of that stone room was covered with human waste and blood. There was no window, only a small hole high up in the wall. Sometimes moonlight slipped through it, reminding Kofi the outside world still existed. But it no longer belonged to him. But the real question is, how can a human being endure that? How do you breathe in a place where even oxygen smells like death? And strangest of all, just a few meters above Kofi's dungeon ceiling, there was a small, beautiful church. Up there, the Portuguese prayed. They sang hymns. They spoke about Jesus' forgiveness, while Kofi's blood, and the blood of hundreds like him, seeped through cracks in the stone floor and dripped down. That contradiction is what blackened the heart of history. White castles, with hearts harder than black stone. Viewers, are you ready? Because we haven't even stepped through the door of no return yet. We still haven't seen what happens to a human soul when that cursed door opens. Kofi wasn't alone. In a space barely 20 square meters, they stacked more than 200 people like firewood. Imagine that. So tightly packed you couldn't even stretch your legs. Shoulder to shoulder, breath to breath. They wanted to turn us from people into product, and the first step was taking away space. When you strip a person of personal space, what you're really saying is, you don't even own your body anymore. The smell in those dungeons. Viewers, no perfume on earth can erase that smell from my ancestors' memory. The stink of feces, the stink of vomit, seasickness without the sea, and the stink of fear. Fear has a smell, sharp and sour, and when it mixes with the dampness of stone walls, it grabs your throat. The guards, people they called lançados, Portuguese middlemen, opened that heavy iron door once a day. That moment was the worst moment. Not because of the whips, no, but because of the light. Light crashing into eyes trained for darkness, like a knife stabbing straight into your brain. They poured buckets of salty seawater over those thin, chained bodies. Not to clean them, only to keep infection and plague from destroying their investment before the ships arrived. Every time that salt water hit the open wounds on Kofi's back, wounds from resisting when he was captured, he passed out. Salt burning into living flesh. But the worst part is this. Elmina wasn't just a prison, it was a factory. Up above, in the main courtyard, Dutch and Portuguese traders sat behind polished wooden tables, sipping old wine and opening leather notebooks. They put a price on every human being. A strong young man like Kofi, worth a certain length of cotton cloth and one muzzle-loading gun. A young woman, worth a few bottles of alcohol and some cowrie shells. They branded them with red-hot iron. Can you hear it, viewers? The sizzle of burning flesh. The marks of trading companies, like the Dutch West India Company, were stamped onto Kofi's chest. He wasn't Kofi anymore. He became Number 47, Grade A Cargo. In that darkness, Kofi heard an old man groaning in the Igbo language, speaking to his own god. They came from different tribes, different languages, but pain. Pain was the one language they all spoke fluently. In the evenings, the castle governor stood on his wide terrace, staring out over the Atlantic, smoking a cigar. The smoke mixed with the smell of grilled dinner, while directly beneath his feet, the women trapped in the women's dungeon screamed from hunger and assault by guards. The walls were so thick the screams didn't reach the governor. Or maybe they did, and to him they were nothing but the sound of gears turning in a profitable machine. All that time, Kofi thought about one thing. Why doesn't the sun rise anymore? He didn't know the sun of his life had already set forever behind those white walls. They were waiting for something to appear on the horizon, waiting for black sails that smelled like death. But do you know the hardest torture? Waiting. Weeks and months in that filth, not knowing whether tomorrow you'd be killed or dragged into an unknown world. In that darkness, people lost themselves. Some went insane. Some smashed their heads against stone walls just to escape. But Kofi reached out in the dark and grabbed someone else's hand. A stranger. Someone whose language he didn't understand. But the warmth of that hand was the only thing telling him, "You're still human. You're still alive." Then the day finally came. Not the drums of a storm, no, the drums on the decks of Dutch ships echoing off the coast. Guards entered the dungeon with smoky torches. They didn't even shout anymore. They just laughed. They knew it was time to cash in. They forced Kofi to stand. His legs had become so weak they felt like reeds. They linked them with a long chain, like beads on a rosary, neck to neck. Imagine it, viewers. If the person in front collapsed, your neck could be crushed by the weight of the chain. They marched us through a corridor they called the Passage of Submission. The walls stank of rotting seaweed and salt. Kofi felt the ground slope downward. The sunlight outside, shining in the distance, didn't smell like hope. It smelled like fear, because everyone knew that light was the last light they'd ever see from their homeland. And then, we reached it. The door of no return. That door was the border between two worlds. On one side, Africa, Kofi's ancestors, bird songs, the taste of tropical fruit, his mother's grave. On the other side, an endless, terrifying blue nobody knew the bottom of. They believed beyond the sea was a world of white spirits, cannibals. They thought they were going to be eaten. When Kofi stood at the doorway, cold ocean wind hit his face. For one moment, he smelled freedom. Then the chain around his neck snapped him back into reality. He looked behind him. Elmina's tall white walls gleamed in the sun like the bones of a corpse. Those ships, viewers, they were floating black holes. When Kofi climbed the rope ladder and his foot touched the wooden deck, a new smell hit him. Tar, wet wood, and the smell of shared death. The captain, wearing a feathered hat and fine clothes, looked at Kofi the way you look at a workhorse. He checked Kofi's teeth, squeezed his muscles, then nodded, ordering them to take him down below, into the middle passage. They shoved Kofi down through a narrow hatch. The ceiling down there was even lower than the castle dungeon. They laid them out so tight it was like teaspoons packed in a box. Shoulder to shoulder with strangers, while everyone's hands and feet were locked together. The hatch above them slammed shut. Bang! Total darkness. The only sounds were the sobs of men who had never cried before, and the waves beating the ship's hull, dragging them farther and farther from home. And in that darkness, someone began to hum. A weak whisper squeezed through clenched teeth, singing a song from their village. The guards whipped them to silence. More than anything, they feared sound, because sound means humanity is still alive. The guards slammed rifle butts into their backs. "Move, animal, move!" They loaded them onto small boats to take them out to the giant ships waiting in deeper water. Kofi reached under the surface and grabbed a handful of suspended sand from the shoreline. He wanted to carry a piece of Africa with him, but a Portuguese soldier kicked his hand open. The sand dissolved into the waves, and Kofi understood he didn't even own the dirt under his fingernails anymore. When the ship moved, Kofi felt the ground shake beneath him. It was his first time on water. The creak of wooden boards sounded like bones being crushed. But that sound was nothing compared to the chains. Kofi was forced onto his side. The person behind him pressed knees into the hollow of Kofi's back. They were chained so tightly that if one person tried to shift, the whole row had to move together. They called it tight pack. Why? Because English and Portuguese captains calculated that if they overloaded by 200 people and 100 died on the way, they still made more profit than with a looser arrangement. Viewers, imagine this. Weeks pass and you can't even lift your hand to swat a mosquito off your face. The ship's floor quickly filled with filth, intestinal disease, blood running from where chains cut skin, air so scarce that even the guards' torches sometimes went out. Kofi felt his lungs filling with lead. Sometimes at night, a strange sound came from the hull. Tap, tap, tap. Sharks. They had learned to follow slave ships. They knew these floating coffins threw dark fruit into the sea every morning. One morning, Kofi woke up and felt the person in front of him, a teenage boy from Benin, was cold. So cold he felt made of ice. Kofi called him. No answer. The boy had died silently in the night, without even being able to turn over. The guards came. They didn't even unlock the chain. With a hammer, they broke the boy's wrist free, or shattered it to open the iron, and tossed his lifeless body out through the hatch like trash. Kofi heard the splash, and then silence. That was the moment Kofi understood. On this ship, death was the only road to freedom. But do you know what hurt even more? The whip of the sun. Once a day they brought them up on deck for 10 minutes. Not to rest, no, to force them to dance. They didn't want their muscles to weaken and lower the sail price. Kofi had to jump and stomp under the lash, his body trembling from weakness. Sailors laughed and sang while Kofi's blood left footprints on the burning deck. Kofi stared at the horizon, at a sun that no longer smelled like home. That's when, for the first time, he thought about throwing himself into the sea. Many did it, viewers. Women held their babies and jumped into the ocean together. They'd rather be food for sharks than slaves to human beings. They believed their spirits would fly straight back to Africa from under the water. They called it the flight of the soul. Kofi stood at the edge of the deck. Wind twisted through his short hair. A Portuguese guard aimed a rifle at him. Kofi looked down into that deep blue. Kofi didn't jump. Not because he was afraid, no. In the eyes of the woman beside him, clutching a dried-out infant to her chest, he saw something. A kind of sacred rage. He understood that if he died, the story of his village, his mother's songs, the truth of this crime, would be buried with him in the belly of sharks. He stayed to be a witness. On that ship, people stopped fearing death, and when you don't fear death, you become the most dangerous creature on Earth. Kofi and a few others had been building a plan for months, using gestures, looks, tiny movements. They didn't speak each other's languages, but revenge is a language that doesn't need words. One night, a drunk sailor left the heavy hatch to the hold partly open while bringing supplies. He believed these walking skeletons couldn't even stand. He was wrong. And on the 21st night, when a storm stitched the sky to the sea, something happened that was never written in any captain's log. Viewers, imagine it. Hundreds of men and women, chained in filth for months, pouring onto the deck like starving lions. They fought with the very chains on their wrists and ankles. Shouts of freedom in different tongues, Yoruba, Igbo, Fula, mixed with the crack of Portuguese pistols. Kofi made it to the captain's cabin. He saw a man in silk clothing drawing maps of how to sell his cargo in Caribbean ports. When the captain saw Kofi, his face turned chalk white. For the first time, he saw a human being in the eyes of a slave. It was brutal. Black blood and white blood mixed on the deck of the ship Santa Maria and washed into the sea with the rain. The captives managed to seize half the ship. For a few hours, they were free. For the first time in months, they tasted the salt of rain on their tongues without a whip hanging over them. But history's bitter fate had another plan. The sailors locked themselves inside the gunpowder storage and began firing small cannons toward the deck. The uprising was crushed. They butchered the leaders, among them that Igbo elder who had been singing, right in front of everyone, then threw them into the sea as a warning. They kept Kofi alive because he was expensive property, but they didn't understand one thing. They took Kofi's body back, but they lost his spirit forever. After 2 months, the ship reached land, but not the land Kofi knew. The soil here smelled foreign: sugarcane, tobacco, and new whips. When the ship anchored off the coasts of Brazil or Jamaica, Kofi looked out through the hatch. They had arrived in what they called the New World. But for Kofi, this new world was just a bigger graveyard, one where he would have to dig until the day he died. When Kofi stepped onto that ground, he thought the earth was trembling. 2 months on the ocean had stolen his balance, but the real shaking came from his heart. In the town square, there was a strange smell: coffee, dirty money, and the stink of a race that believed it owned the land and the sky. They examined Kofi like a workhorse. They didn't see he was the son of a tribal chief. They didn't see he could navigate by the stars. They saw only arms to plow cotton fields. A man shouted, "$800 for this strong Guinea man!" And then, the gavel struck. Bang! In that moment, Kofi died. The Kofi from Ghana ended right there. His new owner, a blue-eyed plantation man, looked at him and said, "From now on, your name is Tom. Name." They took the last thing he still had from his village. They wanted to cut his tie to the past. They wanted him to forget who he was. But they didn't know one thing, viewers. They could change his name. They could bend his body under forced labor, but they couldn't silence the rhythm beating inside Kofi's blood. In those very first nights, Kofi planted a small okra seed he had hidden inside a tear in his ragged clothes into America's foreign soil. That seed was our symbol. They buried us, but they didn't know we were seeds. We rooted in that bitter earth. We hid our language in spiritual songs. We hid our gods behind the names of their saints. We survived. Viewers, Ghana's white castles still stand. The Atlantic still rolls, still keeps the secret of those millions in its chest. But the story doesn't end here. This was only the season of darkness. This is the beginning of a story where the enslaved become heroes, breaking chains not only from their hands, but from the soul of a nation. Kofi, Tom, never returned to Africa, but every night when the wind came from the east, he closed his eyes and smelled the damp soil of his village after rain. He lived so I could stand here today and tell you this story. Our history did not begin with chains, and it will not end with chains. We came from the stars, and to the stars we will return. Tired, viewers? Go rest. But remember, every time you hear thunder, imagine it's the sound of your ancestors' broken chains dancing in the sky. We still have many stories left. Rice fields, hidden rebellions, and a woman who knew the road to the North Star. Next time, I'll tell you about the Underground Railroad.